Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this session. My name's Melanie Crofts and I'm joined by my colleague Hardeep Basra, who will be presenting in the second part of this presentation. Given that I have the presentation mode on, unfortunately I can't see who's in the room and I can't see anything in terms of the chat. So my colleagues Jeff and Hardeep are just going to keep an eye on the chat while I kind of move the slides. Please do use the chat to ask any questions as we go through, but there will also be an opportunity at the end of the presentation for any questions. So if you're able just to keep your mics on mute until we get to the Q&A at the end, unless obviously you're typing something in the chat, that's absolutely fine. Also, just to let you know that we are recording this session, so if you don't want to be visible on the recording, you might want to turn your videos off. That's also absolutely fine. So this afternoon, Hardeep and myself are going to be presenting on the topic of how can we make our teaching truly inclusive. So we're both very much involved with the Decolonising DMU project, which if you've just attended Kashika's presentation, you will have heard a little bit about the history and the background in relation to that. I will touch upon a little bit of that in this session, but just to give you a bit of an overview in terms of what we would like to cover. First of all, I'd like to provide a bit of context to the session, and also looking at issues around decolonising the curriculum. So as you heard from Kashika's presentation, the Decolonising DMU project kind of extended the Freedom to Achieve project, which was focused primarily on curriculum, and Decolonising DMU has moved to look at issues beyond the curriculum, but clearly curriculum is still a very key issue. So we will be spending a bit of time on that. Hardeep will then introduce herself and look at particularly how we are decolonising the PGCAP, and then there'll be a little bit of a summary and hopefully some time for questions and a bit of discussion at the end. So again, if you were in Kashika's presentation, you'll be aware that the history behind the Freedom to Achieve project started with the concern around the degree awarding gap, or what was known as the degree attainment gap. So just to give you a little bit of a context in terms of this. So this is the most recent data that we have across institutions, so sector-wide, from Advanced HE.
Come in, the slide's not moving across, so it's still showing the first slide.
Okay, is it not moving?
No, it's not at the moment. No, it's still just showing the first slide. I don't know if anybody else can see anything different.
Okay, hang on a minute. Apologies, I love this with the tech. Let's see whether I can. Let me come out and try again.
Melanie, if you share your desktop and then open the PowerPoint through your desktop, we'll be able to see the slides and you go through the slides then.
Right, just give me one moment.
And Mel, if that doesn't succeed, I'll try on my end to upload it.
So try again. It was all going so well up until that point. So if I share my desktop and
that's it.
Yeah, brilliant.
And then open it from there. That's it. Brilliant. Right. Should be fine now.
So fingers crossed. Let me move on.
Yeah,
so
all good.
Session overview.
Yeah,
so this
brilliant.
is the data on the degree awarding gap. Excellent. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so as I said, the degree awarding gap is where we started in terms of the Freedom to Achieve project, and the primary focus was focusing on curriculum. And we had 10 programmes that were involved with the Freedom to Achieve project in each faculty. But the degree awarding gap, this is the latest data from Advanced HE in terms of the sector-wide data from last academic year. So as you can see, the gap between white and BAME students, so Black, Asian and minority ethnic students, obtaining a first and a 2-1 is 13.3%. But there is variation across ethnicities. So again, as Kashika mentioned in her presentation, the gap for Black African students, Black Caribbean students and other Black backgrounds is much more significant than in relation to Chinese, mixed and Asian Indian backgrounds. The term BAME clearly is problematic. We'll come back to that in a moment, but it is necessary to have a look at and to kind of drill down into the data to have a look at what is going on in relation to that overall, that homogenous group that we kind of refer to as BAME. Just to highlight that the overall gap at Montfort currently for the academic year 2018-19 is actually 15.6%. So again, it's just worth noting that. The other thing that Kashika highlighted in her presentation was the concept of the deficit model. And this is something that at Decolonising DMU, as part of the project, we're very much trying to move away from deficit model thinking, which is basically the idea that somehow the reason for the differential outcomes for Black, Asian and minority ethnic students is somehow rooted in things that the students are doing. So quite often in the past, I've heard colleagues say things like, well, their family background means that they're not as ambitious, or they perhaps don't push their children to go to university, or that there are other factors in relation to the students themselves that mean that they don't achieve as well. And what we're trying to do with Decolonising DMU is kind of to move the discourse around that to highlighting the structural inequalities within institutions that actually have an impact on differential degree awarding, but also, and that's why we've kind of changed the language around that, because degree attainment places the onus on the student. It's their fault that they're not attaining, whereas degree awarding places the emphasis on what institutions are doing and the barriers that institutions put in place when it comes to awarding degrees to students. So I thought this definition from UUK and the NUS was quite a nice kind of summary of what we mean by the deficit model. So focusing on attributes and characteristics of the student as the main contributing factors, rather than looking at societal institutional structures and the discrimination that exists, which means that that students from those backgrounds are not able to achieve in the way that they should be. So again, at DMU, it's worth just recognising the makeup of our student population. So currently we actually have just over half of our student population would be regarded as students of colour, and over 2,500 international students from more than 130 countries. So, you know, it's about bearing in mind that we have a diverse university. There are diverse identities, you know, the lived experiences of students is going to be very different and also complex and fluid. And as I say, that label of BAME homogenises that student identity, so it sometimes is not helpful. And there are discussions in the university about the use of the term BAME, and particularly in relation to the staff side. And perhaps Hardeep, if people have questions on that later, Hardeep might say a bit more about that from wearing her other hat. But there are discussions around that, and it's important just to highlight that although we use the term BAME, it kind of disguises that diverse nature of the identities that we kind of assume within that label. So moving on kind of to looking at Decolonising DMU. So as Kashika said, the aim of Decolonising DMU is really to build an anti-racist university, to create a safe space where these discussions, conversations can be had, and to move beyond curriculum. So curriculum is still important, but also looking at the broader structural issues within the university that mean that students and staff from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds have worse outcomes in many areas. So this also requires a mindset change as an institution. So it links in quite nicely with the theme of this conference in terms of disrupting and decolonising teaching and learning practices, spaces and experiences. So again, moving beyond the curriculum when we're thinking about our teaching and learning to looking at all of the things that kind of make up teaching and learning. And also that students are reflected in the curriculum through the resources that we use, through the content so that it's relatable to the students, through the role models that we use when we are teaching, perhaps through extracurricular activities and those kind of things. And the idea is to equip all students with the skills to positively work in a global and diverse environment. So, you know, it's just as important that we engage white students in this process and to have conversations around race and racism to enable all students to positively work in that environment. And as I've mentioned, there's a little bit there in terms of terminology. You know, we tend to use Black, Asian and minority ethnic in the context of talking about these things because the data tends to be collected around those categories. But as I say, they're not ideal categories to be placing people in. It homogenises people's experiences and who they are. But we also tend to use terms such as people of colour and also Black, which is quite a political phrase or was. So it's again just worth bearing in mind the terminology, and there are conversations about what terminology we should be using in this space. So I kind of want to move on in terms of looking at the issue of curriculum. So I've quoted Bell Hooks here from her book Teaching to Transgress, and I think this summarises nicely what we're aiming to do. So accepting the decentering of the West globally, embracing multiculturalism even, compels educators for focused attention on the issues of voice. Who speaks, who listens, and why? And I think that's really important, that we're kind of centering and thinking about who it is that we are centering in our teaching and our learning, who we are giving the opportunity to speak, who we are listening to, who is listening, and why we're doing it. So I thought that was quite a nice contextual background to where we want to go. So in terms of decolonising, there are various aspects to decolonising DMU, as Kashika mentioned, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But the key aspects for this presentation are around kind of the curriculum design, delivery and assessment, and in relation to students, the involvement of students in the co-production and co-creation of the curriculum. And I just want to say a little bit more about that. It's also really important to think about how we might co-create not just the curriculum and assessment with students, but also things like study skills and support services. And my colleagues Kay and Samaya are also delivering a paper, unfortunately, at the same time as this one. And Samaya's been doing a lot of work around co-creating study skills for students and for the use of particularly her focus has been on international students, but she has co-created study skills that are applicable beyond kind of international students and more broadly. But if you want to know more about that, I would really recommend that you get in touch with Samaya because she's been doing an awful lot of work around that. So co-creation has been a key element in decolonising DMU and previously Freedom to Achieve, as Kashika mentioned. And the idea was to involve the students to ensure that every student can achieve their potential and see people like themselves reflected in the courses that they study. And to think about how students can co-create the curriculum and assessment design and study skills with us as partners. And there are opportunities to think about doing this. For example, at the moment, the programme and curriculum review in BAU is a perfect opportunity to think about how we can involve students in the co-creation of the curriculum and the programmes that we're looking to potentially review. But it's also about thinking whether there are spaces as we review what we do each year in terms of planning for the year ahead. Are there ways of being able to co-create some of that with our students and involve them in that process? So it's about thinking about the relationships that we have with our students, the personal development, the community that we create, as well as learning and teaching, and thinking about what decolonisation might look like in your own practice. So what kind of things might your teams want to think about in terms of decolonising working practices? So curriculum is one element of that, but are there broader things that we want to think about when looking at decolonising our working practices more broadly? And are there things, because there's an awful lot of work already going on about in relation to this, are there things that are already being done to try and decolonise working practices that can be shared in terms of good practice? And also thinking about decolonisation beyond diversification, so beyond things like and as much as it's important, and so I don't use the term merely lightly, but going beyond things like merely having a diverse reading list or thinking about who's on our reading list. So decolonising moves beyond diversification and kind of diversity in our learning and teaching to really think about those questions that Bell Hooks raised about who we are giving space to, whose voices we are listening to, and what it is that we're trying to achieve with our curriculum. I'm going to finish my bit just very quickly using and adapting something that SOAS has produced in terms of a learning and teaching toolkit. And I did ask their permission to kind of adapt this and use it for our purposes. So we do have permission to do that. So just some questions to kind of think about when considering decolonising the curriculum. So things like, what extent does the content of my curriculum presume a particular profile or mindset of student and their orientation to the world? To what extent do our curricula allow students to understand the origins and purposes of your field of study? So decolonising sometimes seems to be easier, in inverted commas, in some subject areas than in others. But it's also thinking about, well, why do we give the voice and why do we use sources and resources that we do? What is the historical context in terms of how we have reached this subject, this subject area and the way that we teach it? So are there things that we can challenge around the historical context that have led us to where we are in our subject area? Does the curriculum allow and encourage critical approaches to an issue? And are they central to what we're teaching rather than something that is just supplementary? The demographic and profile of authors is obviously important, and do modules enable the use of non-English sources in the curriculum? Of course, there are complexities around all of this that need to be thought through, but are there ways in which we can introduce non-English sources into our teaching and allow students to use those sources in their research? How do the dynamics of the lecture, seminar or tutorial engage students who have historically been discouraged to actively participate or take risks in academic work because of structural and interpersonal racism? And how do we break down some of those barriers in our own teaching? To what extent are tutors and students aware of issues that might constitute racist or racializing behaviour in a learning context? Are we equipped to challenge some of those behaviours? And are our students equipped to challenge those behaviours? And also, how are students' own challenges and aspirations factored into the kinds of pedagogy that we practice? And do we know what they are? Do we ask them about their challenges and aspirations? And do we reflect that in how and what we teach? So, possible adaptations. I'm not going to read through each of these. I'm just going to leave this here for you to have a look at. So kind of thinking about, OK, those might be some of the issues we want to think about, but what practically can we do to decolonise the curriculum? So it is about thinking about the sources that we're using, how we organise our material to kind of have a narrative through our teaching, potentially, that can bring in critical perspectives, perhaps earlier on in our teaching, that might inform the rest of what we're teaching. Thinking about our own research, and are we reading ourselves in terms of different forms of pedagogy, and reading about colonialism and how we might decolonise. But also talking to the students, again, involving them in that co-creation process and maybe talking about some of these issues with them. So yeah, some other examples there as well. And I think it's just important to kind of highlight this issue of disrupting, to kind of thinking and challenging ourselves about how we do things. Just because we've done things in a particular way, does it mean that we need to continue to do that? Or are there things that we can do to proactively disrupt what we've done, and also proactively disrupt issues around dominance and thinking about control and oppression within a classroom context, and how we perhaps challenge some of those things and have those conversations. So I'm not going to go through these in any detail, but just to highlight to you that we already have some examples of good practice going on at DMU. These examples of good practice are actually on our Decolonising DMU website. So rather than spending lots of time, because I don't want to take any more time from Hardeep's section, but these are available to read on the Decolonising DMU website. So either you can Google Decolonising DMU, or the website. I think I've given the details at the end of the presentation. So do feel free to have a look at these, because there are a number of really good examples of good practice. As I say, unfortunately, we perhaps haven't got time. I'd leave them up a little bit longer for you to read if we had a bit more time. But as I say, they are up there, and I think the slides will also be available to you following this session, so you can have a look at these yourselves. And we are always more than happy to hear about good practice examples from colleagues. So if you're already doing something and doing work in this area, please do get in touch so that we can try and capture the good practice that's already going on in the institution. And there's Sumaya's good practice example that I referred to earlier. And finally, some specific resources. Again, on the Decolonising DMU website, we do have resources and a resource list available. And Kay has worked really hard with colleagues to put together a decolonising kind of resource kit for people to use. So again, all of that is on the Decolonising DMU website. But again, there are some specific databases and suggestions as a starting point for perhaps raising some of these issues in your classroom. Just some examples there of some potential reading, and I really would recommend Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress if you haven't already read that. Again, we're always more than happy to hear from you in terms of what you feel that you need to assist you, to support you in the process of decolonising the curriculum. So this is something that we're very aware of, that we want to try and develop. And Kashika mentioned the work that we're doing with Kai in the setting up of an expert group, and hopefully the expert group will look at this issue in more detail. So we will, we're again really wanting to hear from colleagues around the things that you feel you need to support you through that process. And maybe if we have time for discussion at the end, we can revisit that question. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass on to my colleague Hardeep to talk about decolonising the PGCAP.
Okay, thank you very much. Mel, can I ask that you move the slides for me?
Yeah,
I'm going
no
to
problem.
turn my video off because it's interfering with the sound.
No worries. I can't turn my video off because I can only see the slides. So unfortunately, people have still got me on their screen. I apologise for that.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to just build upon what Mel has said, and particularly of what resonates is the section that she talked about looking at beyond the curriculum, and the elements when she talked about considering our own context, the session context when we are delivering our teaching. Okay, and also that slide that she showed about the questions to consider. What should we as academics be considering when we are putting together our curriculum and designing how we are going to deliver? And I was reflecting on this probably last summer, okay, and I'm probably slightly late to joining the Decol project than Mal, who's been instrumental right from the beginning. And what I really was reflecting upon is, here we've got a staff development program, the postgraduate certificate in academic practice, which is a mandatory staff development program that all new academics need to undertake. And looking at the current curriculum and thinking about the Decolonising DMU project, it was almost a pin dropped one day, and I just thought, oh my God, here's a great opportunity where we can actually just reframe the current postgraduate certificate in academic practice to be a key vehicle in being able to support staff to enable them to undertake the work of Decolonising DMU project. And I think in the last few years where we've been delivering the PGCAP and the PGCERP before that, lots of staff buy into the idea of inclusive practice. They all very much understand the importance. They understand that the context, in particular for DMU and the diversity of its students. but sometimes what they lack is the skills, is the know-how, the practical steps. Oh, okay, so that's the theory, that's the framework, but how do I put that into my practice? And that's what we're going to try and do within the PGCAP. So this is work that we've already started to undertake, and Jeff, who's kind of moderating our session today, is actually going to be quite central to this, because he's the module leader for the first module on the postgraduate certificate in academic practice. And what we're looking to do is look at the Decol project, look at the PGCAP to make sure that it is aligned, okay, far more than it is currently, to make sure that we can use the PGCAP as a way to rethink, reframe how we are delivering inclusive practice at DMU. And that is not because we are undermining UDL. If anything, we are championing UDL even more by equipping staff with the ability and capacity to undertake that inclusive practice, okay, by getting them to really self-examine, okay, their own practices within this lens of anti-racist pedagogy to ensure that their practice is truly inclusive, okay. And I think one of the things, you know, reflecting on myself, you know, and this is what, you know, Melanie's asking you guys to do when she's posing these questions to you about, you know, what could you think about in your practice? It's really what we need to do as academic developers. Okay, you know, I looked at our curriculum. I think, oh, is it broad enough? No, it's not. Could more be done? Absolutely. You know, are we using the PGCAP to kind of challenge members of staff to kind of refrain from the norms and behaviours which we're trying to challenge in the Decol project? And, you know, my conclusion was, no, we're not doing enough. We're doing a little bit, but we're not going far enough. And that's what we want to do. We want to actually just reconceptualize the current program to be able to ensure that our students, our academic staff, who are technically my students, have the tools at hand to be able to deliver that anti-racist learning and teaching experience for students. And I think that is what we're trying to do. And I think kind of this resonates to what Kashika said, it resonates to what our new PVC, Katie Normanton, touched upon, that the key to all of this is staff development, okay? And it'd be a missed opportunity if we're not trying to champion that within the postgraduate certificate in academic practice, as it is a key academic tool. So how are we doing this? We're doing this by all the things that Mel's already mentioned, okay? We are going to also, okay, we're going to preach what we teach here, okay? We are also going to look at what we teach. Okay, we are also going to look at our resources, and we started to do this. And we started to do this with Kay, who is our library, and Kate Olson, who's our library link. Okay, and to look at actually what is our curriculum, what are the resources that we're using to be able to teach the PGCAP. Okay, and we're also very importantly look at our approaches, learning and teaching approaches. Okay, so not only do we need to empower our academic staff to think about how they decolonize their curriculum, we need to empower our staff to be able to rethink their learning and teaching approaches. And key to that is going to be revising the reading list through the introduction of critical race theory, critical pedagogy, and through authors of the Global South. Because if we're not doing that ourselves within what is a central mandatory development piece, it's difficult to get staff to do it later on in their career, whether it's just something that they're adding on. Whereas if we're doing it right from the beginning, it's much more organic to someone's practice, and that's what we're hoping to achieve. Mel, if I can get you to move across, thank you. So yeah, you know, the key to this is about empowering academics to understand their teaching practice in the context of the DMU project. So rather than it to be something, the DMU project, which is kind of introduces them later on in their academic career, this is going to be integral. So actually, it's not going to be a sticking on plaster later on, where they're asked to kind of think, well, have you thought about this and have you thought about that? It's actually going to be an integral part of how they are going to be approaching their teaching practice. I'll get onto the toolkit and the expert group in a minute, because that is something that we do want to revisit. But key to this is developing a range of activities to shape that practice. And many of these activities will be now revised and produced to sit within the PGCAP. They are also likely to sit outside of the PGCAP, so they're accessible to all members of staff. Okay, but that is going to be done collaboratively, but by not just the Decol team, but any members of staff who've got an interest or are already engaging in this kind of work. We're going to empower staff to do this through action research, so through the PGCAP. I've already got a couple of members of staff undertaking action research projects along the lens of Decol. Okay, it's about giving staff some protected time to undertake those revisions to their teaching practice, which the PGCAP does allow to do. And also supporting members of staff to actually facilitate those changes they want to make to their practice in a careful and considered manner. Case studies, Melanie's already touched upon those. Okay, there's plenty of case studies actually on the Decol website. The key thing is they're not quite as accessible as they need to be. Okay, but that is something that we are working on. Okay. And there's also something about, we do always talk about actually that from a student perspective, we do need to make sure that the staff body is diverse as well. And I would say that rings true for those that teach on the PGCAP as well. So if the PGCAP academic members of staff are students themselves, that whatever is true for the students is also very true for our staff. Okay, and one of the key things I wanted to kind of emphasize is often there is some challenge and there is some pushback against some of the principles of the Decol project, and it also UDL, and I think there's always kind of misconception that we're only trying to do things to level the playing field for students of colour. Okay, and that is not what we're trying to do here. What we're trying, and I suppose this is the message of UDL, this is the message of inclusive practice. If you do something really well and it is truly inclusive and accessible, it benefits all students. Okay, but we have a group of students which we know who are structurally disadvantaged. So if there are things which we can do in terms of what we deliver and how we deliver it, that's going to benefit them. But that is not at the disadvantage of other students. Okay, if anything, they are benefiting even more. So when Samaya, Mel touched upon some of the resources that Samaya has produced in terms of helping international students in terms of their academic skills, referencing, demystifying assessment briefs, making sure that they understand the language. But that's not just applicable to a small group of students, that's university-wide, which is now why those resources sit at institutional level within the library. So I think that's the message that I want to take. This is not just about creating a new mechanism of working or new ways of teaching for a small group of students, or in our case, a large proportion of students, but it is making it better for all students. And I think as a program leader for the PGCAP, I have somewhat a duty to ensure that my academic staff know how they can take responsibility in being part of that delivery mechanism. Okay, next one, Mel. Okay, so we are going to get towards the to the end, and I'm not going to touch too much upon the dignity of difference slide, because again, as Mel mentioned, this was already covered by Kashika in her presentation. But I think this is what we want to achieve. We always talk about dignity in the workplace, and this rings true for both staff and students. We want to make sure, okay, this is absolutely a central ethos to what we do. And just going back to the point that Mel made earlier in terms of the expert group, this is where you can make a difference. Okay, this is where you can come in and have your input and shape what that's going to be. Look, the call's gone out. from Mel about interest from individuals that want to get involved in the expert group. If you haven't already considered it, it's worth doing, because it's your voices that really matter in shaping this. Okay, yes, somebody be leading it, but this can only be successful if it's done collaboratively. And I particularly, would want to involve academics from all faculties, so that we can make sure that we are representing the disciplinary differences, and there will be disciplinary differences that we need to take into consideration. It's not a one-size-fits-all toolkit. Okay, there'll be bits in it for some, and there'll be others where there might not be things. But until you tell us what those gaps are, we can't work with you to start identifying those. Yeah, Mel, do you want to just comment on that, anything in relation to the expert group, because I know that's something that you're leading on?
I'm just going to stop sharing just so that I can see people. Yeah, so the call for the expert group, as Hardy has said, went out. Technically speaking, the deadline is today, but if people are still interested following kind of attending this session in kind of being involved with the expert group, do please get in touch, and I'm sure we can kind of extend the deadline a bit. That's absolutely fine. But the idea of the expert group is that Decolonising DMU works with CHI in developing, first of all, trying to figure out from people where they are in terms of decolonising and what resources, tools are needed in order to support staff in that process, but then also to develop an integral and kind of comprehensive, call it training. I think training might be potentially problematic, but there might be some training involved, but certainly spaces where conversations can be had, good practice can be shared, to support people in using the toolkit. So it's not just about having a thing, you've got to know how to use the thing, and therefore you need to have kind of the training and the support to be able to do that. So the idea of the expert group would be to think about that and how that could be implemented. And it would sit with CHI, just because Decolonising DMU at the moment isn't business as usual. So at some point it may very well be that the project doesn't exist, because we feel that it's kind of been sufficiently embedded in the university, but therefore we need somewhere to place it so that it's accessible to everyone, and that's why we're placing it with CHI. But we're also developing the toolkit for professional services staff, and that is so important to mention, that yes, this is obviously a session on decolonising the curriculum and learning and teaching, but also it extends beyond that to professional services. So the idea of the expert group would be to have members of professional services on that expert group to help with that as well. And I'm just aware of time and that we perhaps want some time for questions and discussion. So I'm going to stop and give people an opportunity if they want to ask any questions. And I didn't have the Decolonising DMU website on the slides, but I am going to find it now and post it in the chat while people ask questions or type.
Yeah, please do come forward with any questions or just a statement or observation, okay, that you might have about the work that we're just discussing. Yeah, feedback, always welcome. I mean, I take the silence to mean that you actually thought that what we presented is what you want the institution to do. Rene, you want to come in?
Yeah, I have a quick comment, a question actually, because this is I've taught a course for many years at another place called Introduction to Western Philosophy, and that is of course problematic in terms of decolonization. But we often talked about this issue, and we talked about how to implement more cultures into that course. And one of the things it always came back to was this weight between influence and doing what is morally right, where the fact is just that middle-aged white men 200 years ago were very, very influential. And so when I teach, for example, knowledge management, I use Japanese researchers, but when I have to teach about the foundations of economics, I kind of have to go to Adam Smith and Karl Marx. So how do we avoid, sacrificing the influence of some of these researchers in order to do what is a 21st century morally correct position to take?
That's a really good question, and I think it goes back to that issue when I put those questions up of it's not just about who you're using, but the context, the discussions that you're having around the context. So why is it that in certain subject areas we have predominantly white men who are the authority in a particular area? How has that developed? How have we got to that stage? Why is that potentially problematic? And is it just because those voices have been amplified and therefore it's more obvious to use those to use those people because actually that's the material that's available to us? That doesn't mean that there weren't other influential writers and people who are looking at those things from the global south, for example, but it just that they haven't been given the space historically to be able to publish and to be able. So it's about not just using the sources, but having the conversation about why that is, what the barriers are, and then thinking about, well, okay, have things changed recently, and are there more, in our own subject areas, are there more kind of recent sources that we can use to kind of counteract that? Are there people now writing who are critiquing some of the older, more established theorists that we use, but looking at it from a different perspective? And you're right, that might be easier in some subject areas than it is in others, but it's also about just raising that conversation and discussing that with students.
Yeah, I'm literally very quickly. So my background is international relations. So I often start off by teaching the principles of things like realism and liberalism and Marxism, because they're absolutely central to teaching that particular subject area. But I likewise very quickly bring in critical international relations theory, bring in that feminist IR perspective, okay, quite alongside it, okay, in parallel, so that criticality can be there right from the beginning, rather than it kind of be something which is, when I first started teaching IR, it was almost like that's the last thing that you cover because this is central to what you're teaching. I actually tend to introduce it almost in parallel together. So actually, look, here are the mainstream theories, here are the critical theories, and you can look at them side by side. And I think that really did help in, that critical thinking and that evaluation piece in students. So I think it doesn't mean that you need to get rid of certain you don't teach those theories because they're absolutely central to your subject discipline. What you do need is give more weighting to some of those critical approaches that have emerged since. So I think, Mel, I just want to that it can happen. Okay, time's short. So anybody else want to come in for a question?
Amanda, just to come to your point about whether there's a space to share, there's the community of practice, as Hardeep has mentioned in the chat. The community of practice has been on the back burner a bit just because we've realised that people have had so much on their plate, but we are trying to reinvigorate the community of practice. If you're not on the mailing list for that, please drop me an email. I can add you to that community of practice, and we will start to try doing things to try and reinvigorate that community of practice. Any other final comments, questions? Yeah, I mean, again, the comment in terms of engineering is interesting. There are ways and means of doing it. There are, all subject areas can have some form of decolonising, whether that's in relation to the kind of the content. Again, it's having those conversations about, well, why is the content the way that it is? But actually, there are some really interesting events that are going on around decolonising STEM subjects, for example, because and things like decolonising the business school. So people in accountancy have said, well, how do you decolonise accountancy? But there are. I'll try and have a look and see and share, but there are loads and loads of events that are currently going on and being run by different subject groups, actually externally and internally, that look at different topic areas and subject areas and what can be done to decolonise, because there's something that can be done in every subject area. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hardeep. You can decolonise your teaching and learning approach as well as the subject. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think the focus doesn't always have to be. I suppose it goes back to what Kashika is more than just the curriculum. Okay. So there are other things which are within our gift that we can do. And I appreciate sometimes we're not in charge of the curriculum that we teach. We inherent modules, programs which are externally accredited or being designed by other members of staff. But one thing which is clearly within our gift is how we teach. Okay, and so if we can start by making that approach, starting with that, where it's something that you can take charge of, I think that's a good step. I think we should leave it there then.
More than happy for people to get in contact with me or Hardeep if you've got any other queries, questions, feedback, if you want to get involved with the expert group, if you want to be on the community practice mailing list. So please do feel free. Thanks everyone for listening, and we appreciate your contributions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.